There was a mathematician named Klein who thought Mobius bands are divine. Said he, if you glue the edges of two, you get a weird bottle like mine. You're probably familiar with a Mobius band. It's this special shape where if you run your finger on the surface, you start here on the outside, you're running it along the surface, and magically you're ending up on the other side. So we have been able to go from one side of the surface to the other without actually stepping over the edge. We just did it by going once around the loop. So if we were to start spreading paint from here, and we just paint and paint and paint that surface, we'll actually end up painting everything. And so this is called a single-sided surface, or mathematicians also call it a non-orientable surface. Just one face, one paint color needed to paint everything. Now, this particular surface has an edge. So here is an edge. Let's see, if we go along this particular edge, I'm running around here, I'm going through my hand, I'm on the bottom side now, and I'm going through the bottom of the edge, and suddenly I come back up again. So it's only a single edge, but the edge actually goes twice around that loop. Okay? So we have a single-sided surface with a single edge. Now the single-sided surface is pretty intriguing. We got from one side of the surface to the other without having to drill through the surface or without having to step across the edge. Is it possible to make a single-sided surface that has no edges, that's kind of closed? Just like a sphere has no edges, right? It's a closed surface. But in a sphere, to get from the inside to the outside, you clearly have to drill through the surface. So can we make a single-sided surface that has no edges that you could step over, and where it seems impossible to get from one side to the other? You can. It's called a Klein bottle. This is a Klein bottle. Now, how does it, what we said before, apply? Is this really single-sided? Assume that you're an ant, and now the ant is walking on the outside of the bulb and getting to the outside of the handle, walking around the outside of the handle, walking on the outside of the handle, and penetrating through the wall, but staying on the outside of the handle on this inner part. And if you imagine that you're on the outside of this inner handle, you're now inside this bulb. So as you walk around the bottom, you're still on the inside, and you can walk all around the inside of this bulb. You can then continue on the inside of the bulb, walking into the inside of the handle. Now you're walking on the inside of the tunnel all the way around the loop. You're staying on the inside of the handle, and you're coming out, and you're back on the outside again. So it is indeed possible to get from one side of the glass surface to the other.
But didn't you pass, like, you didn't drill a hole, but wouldn't you have needed to drill a hole?
Ah, you caught me. Okay, unfortunately, there are no Klein bottles that have no so-called self-intersections. The Klein bottle really is a mathematical construct that you could do in four-dimensional space without any intersections. Any kind of Klein bottle that you want to do in three-dimensional space does indeed have some kind of penetration. Now the rules for mathematicians is where two surfaces like that, the branches go through one another, they're completely unaware and oblivious that they're branching. You're basically allowed to stay on your surface. You cannot step from one to the other. But of course, implicitly, as you go on this surface through the other one, you basically have gone from one side to the other. And that's why the Klein bottle works in three-dimensional space.
So in the rules of mathematics, the ant doesn't need a drill to get through
It doesn't even know that there is this other surface coming through. It just walks basically on that surface, and it sees no other surface except the one that it's walking on. And so that's how it gets magically from one side to the other. So that is kind of the simplest form of a Klein bottle. It is made by Cliff Stoll of Acme Klein Bottles in Berkeley, and he has an amazing amount of different Klein bottles you can get from him. Just go to his website, Acme Klein Bottles. And for instance, you know what a stein is? That kind of thing they have in the Hofbräuhaus at the Oktoberfest.
Oh, I love the Hofbräuhaus.
There is a stein, except it's a small stein. But it's a special stein. It's a Klein stein. If you look closely down here, you can see it seems to have a double wall. And indeed, it does have a double wall. So now, if you pour liquid up on top, inside, and then you find that there's a hole here that goes from the inner volume into the handle. And so by the time the liquid reaches that little hole and runs down the handle, it will pour into the interstitial space between the inner and the outer cylinder, and it fill the outer space. So you realize the potential. You basically fill in coffee into the outside, and you fill in brandy on the inside, and you're sitting happily in your office. And when your boss comes by, he's aware that you're drinking coffee, but you're enjoying yourself very much with what's on the inner part of it. So this is a Klein stein. Topologically, it is exactly like this Klein bottle, just has a different shape. You know, there's this extra bulb kind of stuffed in. But other than that, it's exactly the same deal. You know, you can walk basically on one surface and then go around the handle, make this unofficial kind of transition through the glass surface and get essentially from one side to the other. So, still a Klein bottle. It's still a single-sided surface that has no edges per se. So here is my Klein stein, and we want to see what happens when we pour a liquid into it. I have a little bit of coffee, and we start to fill in. And at the beginning, everything is normal and nothing special happens. So now, so far, everything is just as it would be in an ordinary stein. But now, as we pour in more liquid, see what happens when you get to the handle. Oh, now it starts to run down the handle here, okay? So now we have a trapped air volume up here, right? And it's kind of hard to now fill it without kind of, you know, shaking a little bit and try and get the air bubbles out. So that's kind of a problem. So maybe we already fill too much. So what we should do is pour out a little bit more. And now that we have more flexibility, we can get. So it's a little bit hard to set up your coffee cup on the outside with then the brandy on the inside, as you can see. But so gradually we're getting a higher filling level here on the outside.
Yeah.
A Klein bottle is made from two Mobius bands. Remember, a Mobius band is a single-sided surface, but it has that one edge. Now, if you take two Mobius bands, a red one and a green one, and they both have just one edge, and now you're starting to fuse those edges together, and you kind of zipper them along those edges, right? What you get? Well, all the edges have disappeared. It's like taking two discs, right? And the two discs have two edges, and you glue the two discs together, they form a sphere. But if you do that here, yes, we get rid of all the edges, but it's still single-sided because each piece itself was single-sided in the first place. So we get a single-sided surface that has no edges. Actually, we get a Klein bottle. Here is something that also Cliff Stoll made. Well, it looks sort of like a Klein bottle. So here is the bulge, right? And here is that handle. And here is that kind of transition where the handle essentially goes through that surface and goes inside that bulb. Now, the beauty of this object is that somewhere here is a zipper. And if I can find the beginning of the zipper, there it is. So now we can open that zipper. That's like cutting the Klein bottle into two parts. So I'm zipping open. You have to go twice around the loop. Remember that these loops here on the Mobius band, they go twice around. So basically I have to zip twice around here. See, now I'm coming on my second pass here. And then it falls apart. And oh my God, what have I got here? I have this band, right? And the band somehow looks twisted. And yes, of course, it varies in width. It starts out narrow, and it gets through the white part, which then forms the bulb. But there's clearly a twist of 180 degrees right about here. So this is a Mobius band. Okay. And the other half is essentially its mirror image. So here again is a Mobius band. And we have seen the two together essentially form the Klein bottle. So that shows how a Klein bottle is formed from two Mobius bands. Here again is an ordinary looking kind of Klein bottle. Okay. I made the bulb a little narrower and I put more emphasis basically on the handle here. And you can see that's the place where the handle goes back into the bulb. I think that's kind of the way these two things look.
Okay.
Now, if you look at the handle, you can see that the lines here in the handle are essentially twisted. So In glass, you cannot see that, whether it's twisted or not, but if you put this structure on there, you can actually give it a twist. Now I put the twisted of a full turn of 360 degrees. And then I cut it apart along a line, not like the other Klein bottle, which I had split simply smack down the symmetry plane. But I essentially cut it down along one of those twisted spiral things. And look what happens. I basically get two of those thingies interlocking now. And each one individually is essentially a Mobius band. You can see it's a band that starts here, it warps around, and then it makes sort of a 180-degree flip up here. So here again is another way of essentially turning a Klein bottle into two Mobius bands, but because of the twist that I put into the handle, now the two Mobius bands are actually intertwined. So most people who have heard about Klein bottles probably have seen a picture of that. That's the most familiar one. But actually mathematicians tell you there's more than just one Klein bottle. And this is also a Klein bottle. At first glance, it looks kind of weird and jumbled. You know, what's going on? Well, what's going on is that we make ourselves a tube like we have here, but the tube now is not having a circular cross-section, but we make ourselves a tube that has a figure-8 cross-section like that. Okay? And you can see if we had to do that and you color it, then if you paint red on the one half of this figure-8, the red would go through that junction and be on the inside of the other lobe, and then green would be on the outside here and green would be on the other side. So if we take this two-color tube and we flip it around in a big circle and join it back to itself, red goes to red, green goes to green, it still would be a torus, just an ordinary torus. But if we take this figure-8 and we rotate it 180 degrees and then join it back to itself, well, the red lobe joins with the green lobe joins with the red lobe. And we have the same situation we had before, that if you start painting and you just paint and paint, before you know it, you've painted everything. So we're back to a single-sided surface. And that's exactly what we have here. So if you focus in on that part, you can see essentially this figure-8 cross-section, which I mentioned before. And I very carefully made sure that right here at the intersection line, if you look at the lines that come from one side, they're going through that cross-section without touching the other ones. Again, that confirms that mathematical notion that where two surfaces cross, you cannot step from one to the other. They're kind of oblivious of one from the other. Okay? So this is our figure-8 cross-section. Now we're swinging this figure-8 cross-section around the loop, and while doing so, we must make sure we have an odd number of flips. Nice. We could get, a single flip from here going once around, a single 180-degree flip, but in this case, I actually have elected to do 3 flips. So here, it is in that configuration, it flips, and here again, it's facing up to you, it flips once more to here, and then once more to here. So 3 times 180-degree flip. Also, make sure that one of those lobes, when you come around, you're on the other lobe. And that makes it into a single-sided surface. And that, again, is a Klein bottle. There are no edges, it's single-sided. It happens to the same kind of connectivity as this particular Klein bottle.
It seems very different from that one.
It is quite different. And particularly, the mathematicians, in this case, when you ask them why are they different, they say because there's no way that you can smoothly transform this object into that object. They have a fancy name. They call something a regular homotopy. If it is possible to buy only smoothly deforming thing, never ever having any sharp creases, never ever doing this kind of thing where you have a loop and then you just kind of get rid of that loop, that's not allowed. As long as you smoothly deform things, no matter how much you stretch and compress, that's a regular homotopy. And two things are sort of equal or in the same regular homotopy class if you can transform them. You cannot transform that into this. That's why these Klein bottles are different. Now, if you look at this, it has clearly a handedness to it. It sort of rotates, in this case, I think, if you go forward, it rotates sort of counterclockwise as you kind of smoothly go forward. You can see that cross-section rotating sort of counterclockwise. Okay? The mirror image of that is in a different regular homotopy class. You cannot transform that into its mirror image. The reason is basically You cannot take a Mobius band and smoothly transform it into its mirror image. It has a handedness built in. Right? And remember, Klein bottles are built from 2 Mobius bands. Turns out the regular Klein bottle here is built from 1 right-handed, 1 left-handed Mobius band. We've seen that before. We had those 2 Mobius bands, and when they fell apart, they were mirror images, a right one and a left one. So here, if you have something that is a figure 8 that twists right-handed, you cut it apart in the middle, it essentially composes into 2 right-handed Mobius bands. The other one falls into 2 left-handed Mobius bands. Okay? So we already have 3 different regular homotopies for Klein bottles, 3 different Klein bottles. Well, that was known in a paper going back to about 30 years by Haas and Hughes, and they make one more observation. They say if you essentially put a structure like this coordinate grid we have or some color on the surface, then there are 4 different Klein bottles. And that really intrigued me. And so I set out, several months of my life to think, I want to find that 4th Klein bottle. Now, the mathematical paper was above my horizon. I couldn't follow all the logics that had to do with group theory and symmetry, observation and the like. I wanted to make a really nice picture to figure out what's going on here. And in that process, I came up with other interesting Klein bottles. So here, what is this? Well, it's again a figure 8 loop. Now it forms a trefoil knot that we've seen before. Actually, it is really no different from that one. Because remember, topologists allow you to smoothly pass surfaces through one another. In particular, a knot makes no sense to a topologist because you have 2 strands and they pass right through one another. So you could open this trefoil knot into just a simple loop, and it would then be simply a triply twisted figure 8 loop just like this one. So this, nothing new, it just belongs to that one. Searching further for that 4th Klein bottle, I came up with this wonderful contraption. I thought that this was really cool because it's sort of like this thing, only there's 2 of them. I call this the inverted sock Klein bottle because at the end the mouth looks like the part of an inverted sock. And this is like the inverted double sock. Okay? And I thought surely that this is different and this must be, the new Klein bottle. Well, to make a long story short, it isn't. The main reason actually turned out that this is not its own mirror image. If I make a mirror image, then it is clearly different. And if you analyze this and you cut it apart into Mobius strips, you find out it's falling apart into 2 identical Mobius strips. Okay? And so again, we have the same situation. We get essentially a right-handed, left-handed version. So the logic says, if this were something new, I get not just 1 new thing, I get 2 new things. A right-handed, left-handed version. But that paper clearly proves there are only 4 Klein bottles, not 5. So this must be something known. And since it fell apart into 2 identical Mobius bands, it really is, in disguise, that same thing object again. So, that was not it. Then I came across this one. This is indeed another special Klein bottle. It's due to Lawson, who proved that this is the minimum energy Klein bottle. In some sense, nature would prefer that. It's like a soap film. Soap films try to take on the shape that minimizes the surface area, minimizes the built-in energy that's in the surface. And so, if similarly we were to look at this surface and there is bending energy required to bend it, and the more you bend it, the more energy you require. So typically, the bending energy of a thin sheet of metal goes with the square of curvature. And so if you integrate square of curvature over this surface and compare it with any other Klein bottle, then this one has the lowest possible energy. I thought, that is pretty cool. Maybe that is number 4. But again, you can obviously tell by looking at it that this thing seems to have some chirality again. So it's not its own mirror image. So again, if this were new, there would be 2 of them. You analyze how it breaks apart in Mobius bands, and you find it breaks apart in 2 identical Mobius bands. So again, we're back on that same heap. Okay, nothing new yet. Okay. Phew. Now here's an interesting shape. It looks like a special Klein bottle that has two inverted sock mouths. Okay.
That looks like a roller coaster or something that should be at Disneyland.
It looks fantastic, right? Now, it turns out it's not even a Klein bottle. Because here's what happens. If you start here on the outside and you go around and you get to the inside at this mouth and you go around the inside of the handle, inside of the handle, inside of the handle, and you're coming out here and you're back where you were. This actually is two-sided. You could clearly, paint it with one color on one side and this the other. So it's just a torus. It's a weird torus, that kind of self-intersects and does weird things. It's not a Klein bottle. So you have to be very careful when you look at these things to make sure whether you have a Klein bottle or whether it's actually a two-sided surface. Sometimes, and that's not a recipe that works quite as simply, but if you have an even number of these kind of surface inversion mouths, then it's just a torus. If you have an odd number, then it's very likely a Klein bottle. So, what is this? Is this a Klein bottle?
That's a monster.
It's a Klein noddle. I call it a knotted Klein bottle. So I can see we have 3 times the kind of mouth that we find out the ordinary Klein bottle. And it's just kind of hooked together in such a way that it forms also a trefoil knot. And so a knotted Klein bottle I call a Klein noddle. And it's a perfectly good Klein bottle.
Is it the magic one?
Nope. It turns out this now brings us back to the ordinary Klein bottle. So it belongs essentially to that shape. As a matter of fact, it's very hard to show that number 4 because it really relies on the fact that you need some coloring and you need to distinguish the longitudinal edges from the cross-sided edges. In the end, it turned out to be rather almost disappointingly simple. If you take this Klein bottle, right, we know we could split it in the symmetry plane and make 2 Mobius bands. One half may be green, the other one would be red. One is right oriented or right twisting, the other one is left twisted. All you have to do is switch colors. Okay? Now, if you switch colors on the 2 Mobius bands, you get a Klein bottle that basically seems to have the color reversed. And there's no way to deform it back into the other one because the right-handed red band cannot be turned into a right-handed green band. But you essentially need colors to find that 4th Klein bottle. So finally, that was the answer. And it's all in the paper. I didn't invent it. I just made it essentially visible to people. And so that was my contribution there. I actually had it peer-reviewed by those mathematicians who wrote the original paper. And they loved it. They felt, I did fair description of what they did, and absolutely it was needed to make a more visible model to have a broader segment of the population actually understand this, right? And so I may have taken, from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 100 or whatever, but that's still an improvement. And kind of cutting through, and I'm rotating my knife all the way around, and then doing it on the other side. The donut will still fall apart into 2 individual pieces.